Claire, that's terrific. Overstated a little bit. We're really in the early stages of thinking about the use of CAT with this client group. I trained with Louise through Hype some years ago and since moved to Bowen, and they were experimenting, I guess, with the use of CAT at Origin at that time, and so my involvement with the service in Bowen, I guess, suggested that this might be something we could develop further. So it is early stages, but we're pretty excited about what, I guess, the collaboration we have with Origin is offering us and what it can offer to the client group. But I'll talk a bit more about that. Essentially, though, I really am just the warm-up girl, because the real show is here. I don't know how I managed to be doing the whole presentation, and luckily I've managed to divert to real experts. So I'm just really here to talk a little bit about our service, to introduce the two of the main players, the main event, and then can take some questions at the end around the service as need be. So as I said, the structure of today, I'll talk a little bit about our service, some of the challenges, where we're going, and then Louise will talk about CAT as a therapy and provide an introduction, and then talk specifically about its applicability with this client group. And then Sarah has kindly agreed to present a case that she has been under supervision through the Origin training program. I never come anywhere without doing a little bit of a promotion about our region. I came down to Geelong in Bowen about 5 years ago, and it's really been terrific. It's a terrific service, very innovative, and enables you to really grow and develop service delivery. And it's also got some gorgeous landmarks and areas, including wineries and beaches, and I think I've even got the cafe where I have coffee. What sort of a view is that? So if anyone's interested, please come down. The football team isn't going as well as it was the year before, but since I don't break for Geelong, that's kind of okay. So this is our region. I guess it's another thing to kind of consider when working in Bowen is there's quite a difference in terms of the client group across a range of our region, from quite regional metropolitan to rurally based areas. So there's some challenges associated with that, and that's our reach as a service. So the Bowen Eating Disorder Service actually had its origins in the GP Association, where they had some funding to provide a service which was in its infancy really an assessment service and support to primary care. Bowen Health took it over in 2007. It was, it's fair to say, very underfunded and really struggling to be able to perform a service in an isolated way, as these things tend to do. So we did quite a bit of work around that time in integrating it with what was then an emerging youth service, which I guess made sense in terms of the onset of disorder and some of the synergies within the board team. And so that happened in 2007. Our current resources at the moment, we have a session with a consultant psychiatrist. Peter, he's not here. I think he might come in later. We have 1.4 EFT in psychology. We've just increased that, and again, embedding our service within our broader specialist mental health team allows us to have some flexibility around cross-funding. We have 0.8 of dietetics. We have a psych registrar day a week. And we also have a partnership with our local PRSS, which allows us some in-reach psychosocial report input, which is terrific as well. And we're very fortunate, I think, in Bowen in terms of our partnerships with NGOs and what that enables us to do across kind of an improved service system. I guess for us, the opportunities, and where CAT comes in, come from predominantly because mental health matters, which we would all be well aware of. And I think it's terrific that eating disorders are really quite prominent in the reform strategy, and that provides us a terrific platform when we're seeking funding or when we're aiming to redesign services locally, that we have this support through our reform strategy. And this will be, none of these statements, and I've just lifted these out of the document, none of them will be new to anyone here, but certainly what they support is an early intervention framework, and recognising that it's the earlier that we can work with these young people, the likely better the outcomes. But it also very much sends the message that we need to be supporting people that are experiencing the most severe mental health problems, including eating disorders, and that is a recurrent theme through the document. The other opportunities that have emerged more recently, the SEED group, and people here have been working on a discussion paper really thinking about best practice and service delivery, so there's a lot of thinking about this, and obviously just in the last couple of months the Victorian framework for the assessment and treatment of eating disorders and the establishment of an expert advisory group, again which came out of the reform strategy, which is getting the experts together across both of those important policy documents in terms of what would be best practice and best care for people experiencing eating disorders. And these are the main themes, and again, no surprise, but they really have been at the back of our mind in terms of how we think about our local service in Barwon. I guess the other opportunities from a statewide perspective are clearly this redesign of 0 to 25, and we've been pretty well placed at Barwon given that we've had jigsaw services and our CAM service, so we've started to think about, I guess, developmentally appropriate service delivery and reorienting our service around that kind of framework. We have some funding coming our way in January 2011, which is with the Youth Mental Health Initiative, which is Peninsula Health are also received. So again, all of this is back of our mind and thinking about how we're going to move ahead. What we hope to do is actually really broaden our eating disorder service within that framework and to utilise some funding in order for us to really very much take a 0 to 25 perspective where we can, which I think is pretty exciting. In terms of what the challenges might be in thinking about this, and these are not unique to us, I'm sure these are challenges that probably everyone in the room are really thinking about. In the 0 to 25 service kind of environment, we need to think about, are there effective treatments that are different for children versus teens and versus young adults, and how do you incorporate best practice and effective treatment within a broader service that's targeting that group. Effective treatment models when family involvement is not indicated, if that ever is the case, or when it cannot be facilitated. Again, this is where the CAMS and the youth models are considering these sorts of questions. And also effective treatments within what is usually a limited treatment service, and being able to make sure that your staff are supported and well trained and supervised in the treatments that you're utilising within your service. Luckily, again going back to the reform strategy, again lifted out of this, is that the reform strategy talks about that best practice treatment and innovative treatment models will be more effectively researched and promoted. And I think that's really important, and we take that very seriously in opening the opportunity to actually look at other ways of doing things and feeling that we have the support from SEED and from the broader network. Which obviously leads me in a beautiful segue into Louise, is the thinking about the use of CAT within this treatment group and really making it part of how we deliver services to young people with eating disorders. So, Louise, thank you again for being involved, and enjoy the presentation.
So I'm just going to, I guess, give you a bit of an introduction to cognitive analytic therapy. I run a training program over at the Origin Research Centre, and at the moment that's actually the only training program there is in Australia for cognitive analytic therapy. It's used quite extensively in the UK, and it's kind of been picked up in various places throughout more Europe than the US. US are pretty wedded to some other sorts of models at the moment, and I guess cognitive analytic therapy is one of those models that runs along in a parallel way to CBT. It's a short-term therapy, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So I guess you may not have heard of it before, you may have heard of it before. In Australia we tend to talk about it in relation to personality disorder, but actually in the UK it's been used quite extensively for other sorts of presenting problems, and it's only more recently been used with personality disorder. But in Australia, because the Hype Clinic picked it up and have been the ones promoting it or using it most extensively, that's where it's found its niche in Australia, but it's certainly not limited to that at all. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about CAT. The key features are that it's a very collaborative model. The whole essence of CAT is working with the client, doing it with together, and developing all of the tools and all of your formulation together with the client. And because of that, it works particularly nicely with difficult problems. You're working with people, you're not telling them what to do, and they're not working therefore against you. So it's very respectful because of that. It was developed for the use of public mental health services, hence why it's a reasonably brief model. The reality is we can't offer long-term therapy very often in public mental health. So you need to have something that's going to be intensive and brief. It's not going to fix everything, but it might then teach people their tools to be able to go on working with things themselves. And that doesn't prevent people from coming back to therapy later or even going on to longer term therapy with using a different model. That's fine. It's very compatible with other things. It is really particularly good as an early intervention. What about if we give people a short, brief burst of therapy and see what they can do with it? And that's particularly controversial for things like eating disorders and personality disorders because we think it's going to take a very long time for people to get better. So this is a different kind of model to be presenting for those sorts of complex problems. Often people feel a bit uncomfortable about it. And certainly we have, as a personality disorder service, struggled with that and thought a lot about it. And we quite like offering a short-term model to see what people can use. And it's quite surprising often the people that do well. So it's time limited. The usual way that people work is to offer 16 sessions for the kind of ordinary sorts of presenting problems like depression and anxiety. The most common problems, I don't really mean ordinary. The more complex problems you might offer 24 sessions. So that's the most frequently used kind of package of sessions. People sometimes use long-term, the CAT model in a long-term way, but that's less common. And it has clear descriptions of its theoretical basis. It's not just an amalgamation of a whole lot of cognitive or analytic techniques stuck together. It's actually a theoretical model in itself. So I'm going to try and tell you a little bit about that. It developed as an object relations informed approach to cognitive therapy. So it was developed in the 70s alongside the sort of emergence of cognitive thinking, cognitive theory. It doesn't have behaviour in the title, but you can use behavioural techniques. But that's why it was developed at the same time as the cognitive thinking. That's why it's only cognitive analytic therapy. And the idea that Tony Ryle had, who developed it, was very much to try and find a language so that the two sort of big camps, the cognitive field and the analytic field, could actually talk to each other, because they do talk about similar things sometimes, but they use such different language that the ideas don't get communicated. The analytic people talk about countertransference and transference and all of these things, and cognitive people don't know what they're talking about. It's a bit of a mystery. So the idea in CAT was to get some language going that actually would span all of those and bring the best from both and actually make it into a model itself. It's been fairly heavily informed by Vygotskian activity theory. I'm not going to kind of go into that in a lot of detail, other than to say the major contribution from Vygotsky was that he looked at what was really happening there between people, between mothers and babies. He did, years and years and years of just observing what goes on in communication, what goes on in social relationships. And he took the evidence that he could see and used that to inform his thinking, rather than making up what people are thinking in their heads, which is kind of more what's been happening in the dynamic field. People talk about conflict. No one can actually see that. They're imagining what's going on in people's heads, and Vygotsky was much more interested in what do we actually see happening. So that's all I'm going to say about that. People might disagree, that's okay. Tony Ryle developed this in the early days in the 70s when there was a lot of warring between the camps. So really his way of trying to manage the two big schools in the UK at the time was to come up with some language that might actually span the ideas of both. Cognitive analytic therapy is cognitive because we actually pay a lot of attention to the client's capacity to think about themselves. That's really one of the most important things we're trying to actually work with. How does one develop a meta stance, an ability to stand back from your thinking, your thoughts, your assumptions, your beliefs, all of that, and have a think about it? If you can't do that, you're stuck in it and you're really trapped by what's going on. So CAT is very much teaching people how to step back, how to reflect, how to think about that. It's also analytic because we're talking a lot about what people don't notice. What's happening just out of their awareness? How are they behaving in a way that they hadn't really stopped and thought about? It's not very much more complicated than that in CAT. It's not what are their inner conflicts and drives and things like that. It's just what have they not yet noticed? What is out of someone's awareness? That's really all that CAT thinks about in terms of the unconscious. But the thing is that a lot of our behaviour is automatic and we don't stop and think about it. So in CAT what we do is we help people step back and think about what they're doing and why they're doing it. What is going on in your relationships? What is going on? How come you get stuck in the same kind of patterns? We also use the therapist-client relationship a lot, and that's really important for working with complex problems. You need to be able to have a language to talk about why is this really difficult between you and me? I'm asking you to do something you don't want to do. How are we going to work this out? I'm really concerned about you. You know, you're starving yourself or something. You know, how are we going to work together on this problem? Every time I say this, you feel that. What are we going to do about that? And so you're actually working on you and me in the room together. And you have a language to do that. One of the things that Tony was most concerned about in picking up cognitive ideas was he had to make up. He didn't really know how to be able to talk about that all the time. It's kind of one of those things that you develop through experience, but the model doesn't teach you how to do that. In CAT, we actually teach people how to talk about it, the relationship with the client. CAT is a very relational model. Relationships and interpersonal functioning is the centre of what we're trying to talk about, what we're interested in. So it starts with the idea that the early relationships one is exposed to are the ones that shape how you relate then to other people in your life, but not only that, how you relate to yourself. And they have an impact on the way that we then go and behave in our life. So if we have relationships that we feel comfortable in, we can often go back and revise the behaviours that don't work. If we've not learned in our early relationships how to stop and think about that, whether it's okay to question, is it okay to review what we're doing, it's much harder then to do that in later life. And we talk about these in terms of patterns. So one of the big things in cognitive analytic therapy is that we talk a lot about patterns. Why do we end up doing the same thing over and over again? Why is it difficult? The idea is that children are hardwired, born ready for social interaction, and communication is happening right from the moment they're born. Okay, that child was less than 3 months, and there was clearly communication going on, wasn't there? There was turn taking. There was all sorts of information being passed on between mother and child, even before there's language. So children are exposed to a whole range of, hopefully, caring relationships through their early years. Normally, the process would be expected that you would internalise not only the experience of being cared for by your parent, but you would also be internalising the experience of caring for others. In CAT, it's a dyadic model that's internalised. It's a caring and cared for relationship that's internalised. And I think that's a little bit different perhaps from the older, certainly, thinking in object relations where it's more the child position is internalised separately from the parent sort of experience. And what Vygotsky contributed to the model was that internalisation process is first enacted with others. So what we see in young children is that they start behaving like a carer towards animals, towards their dolls, towards other things. They feed their mother, you feed them, they feed you back. And so they're enacting both sides of the relationship right from the word go. So it's a dyadic relationship that's internalised. These are called reciprocal roles. That's the jargon in CAT. They're called reciprocal roles, and the reason they're called that is that we want to capture the dyadic nature. It's a caring to cared for relationship that's internalised. So the early kinds of experiences that a child has are then enacted over and over again. We learn as we grow older how to care for ourselves in our thinking. We can say, oh, I've had a really rough day, I need to do something nice for myself. You know, I think I'll go home and have a nice hot bath, I think I'll go to bed early, I think I'll settle down on the couch and watch that really slushy movie with a bottle of wine. We do all sorts of things that enact a caring relationship towards ourselves. Hopefully we don't drink too much wine, they might not be caring. But that's an example of how we've internalised the caring as well as the cared for experience. So as we repeat them over and over, we look for people that actually will enact that with us. And they become more and more familiar and automatic. We're not always very good at stepping back and realising that that's what we're enacting. But that is what we're enacting. So we interact with others as if they will respond in the familiar and expected way. We look for people who will enact the other part of that. We look for a partner who's going to be caring for us. And how often do people say, well, gee, I picked someone who's kind of similar to either my mum or my dad. That's why we do that, because we're enacting a familiar kind of pattern that we've experienced over years. We also interact with others in order to elicit particular kinds of behaviour. When that pattern is familiar for us, we know how to behave to elicit particular behaviours back. And all of us are in reciprocal roles all the time in the CAT model. We're all enacting particular reciprocal roles. Right now we're enacting one where I'm teaching you and you're learning or listening or sitting there sceptical, I'm not quite sure. All of those are fine. But we're enacting all the time. And as good enough or normally raised people, we can move in and out of different sorts of reciprocal roles quite seamlessly without much problem. In less optimal situations, a child might be exposed to a much more limited range of particular relationships with carers, and they might be much harsher and more damaging. In that case, the child is more likely then to develop a limited range of relationship styles themselves, so the way they relate to themselves is going to be much harsher and more limited. They're also going to behave that way with other people, because that's what's been modelled, that's what's been internalised. They're also more likely to develop self-defeating patterns in terms of their thinking and behaviour. We call those patterns procedures in CAT. It's another piece of jargon. And really what it's referring to is the organisation of thinking, action, and reflection or revision on that action. So it's about a pattern of behaviour that follows from an uncomfortable experience, or any experience actually, in a relationship. So some of those are helpful if we want to get something that we want and we're with somebody, we know a pattern of behaviour that will get us what we want. In a normal situation or in a good situation, you ask nicely and someone says, well, actually it's not convenient for me to do that. What about we negotiate? And I say, well, could you do this instead? Or this, could you do it on Friday instead of Tuesday? And they say, okay, yes, I can do that. So you end up people getting what they want. So that's a helpful procedure. In other situations, if somebody hasn't learned how to do it, enact that procedure usefully, it might be that they come in and demand something, I really need something now. You say, I can't really do it now. They get very angry and they throw the chair around in the office and you say, well, that's it, I can't see you anymore. That's an unhelpful procedure, yeah? So people develop the procedures that they enact as a result of their early experiences and perhaps not knowing how to manage them better and not knowing how to revise those better. Okay? You following me so far? All right. The procedures that people learn are established often early in life. Now, CAT is not a model that says once you turn 2, that's it, it's over for your experience, nothing can contribute to you after that. I'm kind of exaggerating a bit. CAT is a model in which people, we would expect that people's experiences do shape what happens to them and what they learn in life. But the earlier experiences are probably going to have more impact simply because they've been going on for longer. They might have started so early that there was no language to process them. So the early experiences are probably going to be more important, but not necessarily so. We all know that some clients have been very badly traumatised later in life, and that has then dramatically altered their development or their functioning. So it can happen later in life that the whole pattern is disturbed, but it's less likely. The patterns are often very general. They exist across a whole range of situations. So if I know how to get on with people in my social life, I can usually manage better in my workplace. I can manage better in novel situations when I'm trying to deal with people that I don't know. If someone hasn't learned to do that in their family situation, then they often have difficulty in their school or their workplace. They often then have also difficulty managing situations that are novel where they don't know people. So it's common for people to actually keep using the same strategies across situations. They won't look exactly the same, but they might follow the general pattern. They also resist revision. Once we've learned how to do something and practiced it, it becomes a bit automatic. It's hard for us to stop and think, boy, when I do this, it really doesn't work. How am I going to do something different? Now, the people who are kind of have had good experiences and have been encouraged to question and encouraged to think about what they do and encouraged to actually try a different solution will do that. So we often have people come to therapy and they can actually revise the problems when they really sit down and think about it and work on it. But we also see many clients who really struggle with that. Even in the face of this strategy does not work, I cannot change it. I'm sure everybody in the room has had somebody sit there saying, I know this doesn't work and I just don't know how to do something different. So what we find is the procedures, and particularly the unhelpful ones, are very hard to revise. That's why people come to therapy. Tony Ryle, when he was doing this early work, divided the sorts of common patterns that people present with into 3 different kinds. Traps are vicious circles, the ones that just go round and round and round and round, and I'll give you an example of one of those in a minute. Dilemmas are polarised extreme choices, which is the black and white thinking in CBT. Either I have friends and I fight with them all the time, or I don't have any friends and I feel really lonely, and that's all there is. And you're sitting there going, that's not all there is. Surely there must be something else. But from their perspective, there's only those 2 options. Either I fight with people all the time, or I'm lonely and have no friends. Snags are the self-sabotaging kinds of problems, and they're always the ones that are really going to be difficult to work with in therapy. They're the reason why things just can't get better. So it might be that the person feels that ultimately they don't deserve to have a better life. If you ultimately believe that, if that is your core schema or your really primary belief about yourself, I'm worthless, I don't deserve to have a good life, therapy is going to be hard work. So it's important to know what those snags might be if you're working with somebody. So I have to bend down because it's so small. When I feel hopeless and worthless, I expect to do poorly at things. So that's your initial belief. When I feel worthless, when I feel depressed, I also feel worthless and hopeless, and I don't believe I can do anything. So this shapes how I perform. I don't really bother trying very hard. If I'm already thinking I'm useless at everything, I'm not going to put in the effort to really try hard. That means that then when I do try and I review my performance as not very good, probably even more poor than it actually was. It may well be poorer than I could do, but also I'm going to judge it negatively, and that's then going to confirm that I'm hopeless and worthless. So as you can see, it's just a vicious circle, just goes round and round and round. Does that make sense? Sorry about that. Oh, good, now it won't change at all. Okay. So there are 3 phases in the CAT therapy. The first phase is the reformulation phase. Now, I've put sessions 1 to 4, that is a little bit approximate. It's approximately the first 4. What you're doing is rewriting the story together. So yeah, a person always presents with some thinking about why they've gotten to their situation, why things are the way they are. And it might be because they did it to me, or because, I was abused when I was a child, or, my parents think this about me, or whatever. So the early sessions, you spend some time getting to know the person and really understanding what their experience is. Why do you think the way you do? I know the facts about you, but what has it felt like growing up in your situation, in your family, with your parents, with your family, siblings, whoever were around? What was it really like? So you're getting into a qualitative assessment, really. You're asking about what their experience was, and you're developing a new understanding of it. That's why it's a reformulation. You're actually developing a new way of seeing things. And you're starting to help people link why they've made the decisions they've made to events that happened, if they can remember them, or experiences. You're trying to help them understand the links between what happened in the past and what's happening now, what they've brought from the past into now. We actually then write them a letter that summarises that. And you'll hear Sarah read out a letter that she's written to her client. We also start drawing a diagram of the way that those patterns seem to have emerged. Now, this is not a static kind of thing. Once you've drawn the diagram, that's it. This is an ongoing process. It's a tool that you use to reconfirm that we're on the same page, that this is a joint understanding of your story. So it actually doesn't matter what the diagram looks like. There are some conventions about the way we usually draw them, but actually it doesn't really matter. It's a tool that we use together to describe what's happening and what's difficult, what we're working on together. The recognition phase is kind of the middle section, and really what you're doing then is deepening the understanding of the shared reformulation. You're developing and increasing the client's ability to step back out of the problems and to think about what they might do differently. Now, sometimes that will be really focused work. You might have to teach people skills if they can't think of how to do things differently themselves. At other times, CAT is very much just the framework, and people are able to generate the skills they need. Once they see that they just keep going around in those vicious circles, they can go, oh my God, why am I doing that? I know I can do something different. So some of it is about just helping them step back. Some clients are able to step back quite easily. Some take a long time to be able to step back. It depends. So that phase can be very different from client to client. But the job of it really is to develop the understanding and to keep encouraging the client to step back, think about it, think about what they're doing, what doesn't work, and develop some new patterns. And the ending sessions are really about summarising what you've done together, what still needs to be worked on, because there's always things that are still to be done. The goodbye letter that you exchange, the therapist would read out a goodbye letter to the client, and you usually ask the client to write one to you. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Young borderline clients don't often write letters back. Maybe eating disorder clients probably do. So we exchange goodbye letters. Some of that is about acknowledging the process of therapy, what it's been like. It's discussing the actual physical relationship, not physical, genuine relationship that you've had with your client. Usually it's not physical. Can I just stress that? That was a very bad thing to say. Usually it is a real genuine relationship that you have in the room with a client. And one of the nice things about CAT is that as a therapist, you do get to talk about your relationship with the client. Instead of pretending that you don't have one, clients think they have a relationship with you. It might be awkward, it might be uncomfortable, it might be warm, it might be caring, but they always feel they have some relationship with you, and yet we often don't have a way of talking about it. So in CAT we do write about that in the letter, and we do talk about it in the room. The ending is also about making sure we've really practiced the new kinds of patterns. So we're enacting a new kind of relationship often between the client and the therapist, a more caring one perhaps than they've experienced, especially the borderline clients, but also perhaps for eating disorder clients as well. It's often a more reflective sort of relationship, a more accepting and thoughtful kind of relationship than they've experienced, less critical perhaps. So we talk about that. Yes.
Does the therapist write a letter too, or just
Yes.
one?
You write a letter to the client, and then you ask the client if they would like to write one back. The final sessions are on the agenda the whole time. So the ending, because this is a brief model, you're all the time thinking and working towards the ending. All the time you're thinking, what do we need to do? What do we need to make sure we've talked about before we finish up? This is only a brief model. You will only be here for for 4 months or 6 months. How are we going to make sure we've covered what we need to cover? So abandonment and things like dependency are things that you talk about in the therapy. And sometimes they're really hard things to talk about in the therapy, but it's on the agenda, which means that you're working towards it all the time, instead of the ending coming up and suddenly, oh my God, I can't cope without you. And then in CAT we offer follow-up sessions. It is a little bit variable. If you're using a 16-session model, we would usually offer one follow-up. When you offer 24 sessions, typically we would offer more follow-ups than that. But actually it depends on what you think is the best for the client. The purpose of the follow-up sessions are to review the progress rather than to open up new information or new areas. But it might be that you discover there's some new areas that really you didn't get to in the therapy. And then you can have a discussion about whether the person needs more therapy or different therapy, or they can manage to start to think about those things themselves. So how does change occur? What is the kind of mechanism of change in CAT? The therapist is aiming to make lots of links between the past and what's going on now. And sometimes that's actually easy if people are able to think about the past without a lot of angst and are interested in doing that, interested in the question why is this happening? Some clients are not though, and then you have to be more tentative about that process. But almost always there are reasons why things are going on the same way that we can talk about and we can think about. In CAT, it's really important to be thinking about the ability of the client to be able to step back and reflect. That's really what we're teaching, one of the most essential things we're teaching in CAT, or developing. We're looking at how they might develop more helpful relationships, and that's with us, primarily. It's also with other people out in the client's life, and also with themselves. So often clients come with very harsh, critical relationships with themselves. They're the worst person. They don't need harsh critics out in their life because they've got them in here. So one of the most important things is we talk about their relationship with themselves. We talk a lot about how they enact that in life. So how does that get played out in terms of their thinking and feeling and beliefs and behaviours. So what sort of patterns do they enact that actually reinforce those relationship patterns? One of the other things that I think is an important feature of CAT is that we as a therapist are thinking all the time, what are the unhelpful patterns that we could enact with this client, and how do we avoid that? So if a client is very harsh and critical about themselves, I'm ugly, I'm fat, I'm a useless piece of crap, we need to be really careful about in any way enacting that sort of critical pattern. So for example, the client comes in and says, well, I've done really badly this week, you know, I was supposed to be following this diet and I actually did all this other stuff and I was binging this many times, blah, blah, blah. We have to think about what we enact. Do we enact a critical stance or not? And obviously most of us here don't want to do that and try pretty hard not to do that. The point is though, with automatic patterns going on, we have to always be aware where we are as well as where the client is. Another example would be a controlling kind of relationship. How hard is it to stay out of controlling relationships with eating disorder clients? How often do we feel pulled in to tell them what to do or control what they do? Force feeding is a very good example. You know, the whole inpatient unit setting is a controlling setting. And if that's one of the problematic patterns, how do we work with that in the therapy? How do we actually help that be something we can talk about with a client? What else helps facilitate change? Well, we have a whole set of kind of collaboratively developed tools that we use. Some of those, you know, patients love and some they hate, and it will depend on it completely on the individual. You use them, you don't. They're only tools. So the kinds of things that we often use in CAT is a diagram to describe the patterns. One of the things that's good for is actually helping you take the heat out of a relationship sort of issue. If you want talking about something that's very powerful, to be able to then move to a diagram, which is a picture with no people in it, that helps you take the heat out of it, the intensity out of a difficult situation. So the tools are tools for a whole lot of reasons. They actually allow you to manage the intensity of the therapy, how fast it's going. They allow you to manage and stay within the capacity of what the client can manage. You can do very simple diagrams or very complex ones, depending on the functioning of the client. We write letters, so there's a reformulation letter and a goodbye letter. They're the most commonly used ones, but you can use letters at other times. We have some other sorts of tools. The psychotherapy file is just a list of the common traps and dilemmas and snags that sometimes people who like pencil and paper sort of things can go through, and it helps them learn how to reflect on the kinds of patterns that they commonly enact with people. You can do things like monitoring and diary keeping and journaling and all of those sorts of things. The other main thing that we're doing is exploring what those patterns are about. So that's the job, if you like, of what you're doing in the therapy. So, quick summary, what works about CAT? It's an integrative model. It allows you to incorporate the whole range of what's going on for somebody. It's not something where you say, well, I'm sorry, substance use is not actually something we're going to talk about today. You draw a substance use on your diagram as well. If that's the problem that you have and that you engage in that in a particular situation commonly or as a way of dealing with uncomfortable feelings or something, we need to have it on the diagram. So you can include everything that's going on. You might not work on everything at once, but you can certainly have an understanding of how those things all fit together. You can use a variety of treatment modalities. So if you like some of the techniques that you use as CBT or from any other training that you've done, you can use them in CAT because CAT is the framework that then allows you to do what you think is important for this client and this work. So you can use whatever else you've been doing. It's a collaborative, open, respectful model. You do a lot with, you don't do much to. If you're doing two, you're not doing CAT anymore. The therapist takes a curious stance. So why is that? Tell me more about that. Do you wonder if this is linked to that? Do you think so? Could we explore that a bit more? It's time limited, and that allows us to test out how much therapy does this person need in order to get some improvement. Maybe a small amount will be enough for this person, and particularly that's helpful in early interventions or not. It provides a language for managing interpersonal tensions respectfully, both between you and the client, but also between team members. If you all understand the model, it's particularly useful for managing why you want to do something different with this client than I want to do. Now, both of us want to do the best for the client. How are we going to resolve that? What do we think might be happening? You might feel more like you need to jump in and intervene right now than I do. How are we going to manage that? And with complex clients, those sorts of team tensions happen all the time. We all know they do. And we need to find ways that we can respectfully manage those. And this allows us to do that. Okay. Now, any questions about that just whilst Jessica's... Oh, sorry. Sarah. That was a terrible one too. Luckily I could catch them.
And no, I'm not the client.
This is not the client, this is not Jessica. Yes.
Thank you, that was very interesting.
Okay.
I just wanted, in asking the question why and eliciting patterns the way you do, of looking back and saying that it's an interpersonal pattern or a sort of intrapersonal pattern, that's what you're doing, right? And well, how do you manage the issue of blame?
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Blame's really, really important, isn't it? Kat very much takes the stance, people do what they do because they're doing their best. Okay? I don't think people run around doing really dramatically horrible things to themselves, like starving themselves, because they think that's a good idea. And then maybe eventually down the track they argue that. But I don't think essentially they think that's the best way to do things. They didn't start that way. But they've got there. And so I think people do things for a whole lot of reasons, and we have to understand what those reasons are. So we would talk about that very openly. It's going to be really unhelpful if you sit here thinking I'm blaming you, or if we both just blame someone else. How can we understand what's going on? Yeah. So we would talk about that as a particular reciprocal role that gets going. Someone's been blaming and someone feels blamed. So if the client comes in and says, everyone says it's my fault, I feel really awful, I feel guilty all the time because I'm hurting my family, I'm hurting myself, but I can't stop. We'd be talking about, okay, well, it's going to be really unhelpful to look at it while we're stuck in blaming and blamed. It would be more unhelpful if you felt I was blaming you too. How can you and I step out of that pattern to look at what's going on? What about if we were to step into a pattern that's about accepting what's going on from a non-judgmental stance? What about that? Does that help? Yeah. I think it's a really good question. Any others?